My name is Terry Pinkard. I was a professor at Georgetown University, right? And I'm very glad to be introducing Luca Illetterati here. Luca is a well-known scholar of German idealism, a particularly well-known scholar of Hegel. He's a professor at the University of Padua, where you teach in theoretical philosophy, right? Luca is, I say, a well-known scholar in Hegel scholarship. In Schelling and Hegel, however, he's also particularly well-known for his views on the Naturphilosophie of Schelling and Hegel. And in fact, he's even got his own position about a nicht naturalistische Naturphilosophie, or nicht naturalistische Natur. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Luca has to say today on this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you to everyone, and thank you to the organizers for this wonderful workshop and conference. I'm not so confident in English, and so please, okay. What I would like to focus on this contribution is the crisis that the concept of the Anthropocene has produced in relation to the classical categories with which the word has been interpreted within modernity, and therefore, first and foremost, the crisis of the notion of nature and culture, and with it, the notion of autonomy as the pivotal notion of the self-determinacy character of the spirit. According to Bruno Latour, the Anthropocene is not simply the overlap of nature and humanity, each taken as a whole, nor is it the reconciliation of their conflict, but rather the deconstruction of the supposed autonomy of each of these concepts. In this sense, the concept of Anthropocene is an excellent marker, clearly recognizable well beyond the boundaries of stratigraphy, as it is first and foremost a philosophical and political concept rather than ideological one. According to Latour, it is a concept that asks us to truly and definitively turn our backs on the notion of modern and modernity. It is a concept that forces us, in a certain sense, to start over, to question all the concepts and categories with which we have traditionally thought about the world and how to inhabit it. In particular, what the Anthropocene would confront us with is the impossibility of continuing to think of the world as if it were composed of two domains, namely nature on the one hand and culture or spirit, if we want to use Hegel's word, on the other. On the one hand, a reality, nature, understood as the space of laws in which objects and events are defined essentially by their causal relationships and by the laws that govern these relationships, and on the other, another reality, culture or spirit, understood as the space of reasons in which autonomous subjects act according to reason that cannot be reduced to forms of causal determinism. In describing the peculiar ontology that characterizes what Latour calls the people of nature, the modern West that would make external, unitary, and unquestionable nature the centerpiece of its relationship with the world, he states that, I quote, "is a thought these people had to make their cosmology revolve around two focal points at the same time, one in which everything is external, where nothing is made by humans, the other in which everything is internal and made by humans." Two spaces, end of quotation, sorry. Two spaces which, although antithetical, actually support each other in that each receives its specific determination in opposition to the other. So, to use Latour's words again, I quote, "In the Western tradition, we never speak of the one without speaking of the other. There is no other nature but this definition of culture, and there is no other culture but this definition of nature. They were born together, as inseparable as Siamese twins who hugged or hit each other without choosing to belong to the same body. End of quotation. In this sense, according to Latour and a significant part of contemporary anthropology that has gathered around what has been called the ontological turn in anthropology, Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, to name two of the best known, believe that the use of the concepts of nature and culture as universal categories not only limits our understanding of other cosmology and ways of being in the world, but also substantially prevents us from coming to terms with what the Anthropocene would otherwise force us to come to terms with. The proposal I would like to put forward and discuss here is that saying that thinking radically about the Anthropocene means doing away with concepts such as nature and culture, or nature and spirit, is actually a hasty and deeply problematic step. Of course, thinking about the Anthropocene means radically rethinking these concepts and their relationship. At the same time, I don't think it really makes sense to erase them by treating them simply as remnants of an era and a way of thinking that we need to leave behind, not least because attempts to move beyond the difference between nature and culture generally risk turning into processes of radical naturalization of culture or radical culturalization of nature. They risk turning not into an overcoming of the binary opposition, but rather into the domination of one pole over the other. To put it perhaps somewhat roughly, what I would like to show is that what the Anthropocene asks us to consider is not so much the cancellation of the concepts of nature and culture or spirit, but rather the impossibility of taking them as given concepts, as if each indicated a clearly defined ontological domain with respect to the other. What I would like to show is that these two concepts, rather than as opposites, should be thought as one being the critical instance with respect to the domain of the other, or each as a concept capable of relativizing the total autonomy claimed by the other. To take the concept of nature as a critical concept means in this way to take it as a concept that is capable of highlighting the limits of a conception of spirit that sets itself up as autonomous beyond nature, as a radical otherness with respect to it, and that precisely because of these, because of its ability to place itself beyond and claim its own autonomy and self-sufficiency, who has to be capable of dominating it. Similarly, thinking of spirit as a critical concept means thinking about the limits of a conception of nature understood as a mere realm of laws separated from the dimension of subjectivity, as if nature were nothing more than the neutral background within which subjectivity acts. To put it another way, taking nature and spirit as critical concepts highlights how spirit isn't the realm of a disembodied agency separate from the materiality of the world, and how nature is not just materiality without agency. Or to elaborate further, this certainly means thinking of spirit as a process and an activity of denaturalization of nature. But it also means thinking of this project and of this process and this activity as something that is inherent in nature itself, which removes nature's characters of mere giveness in order to recognize in it the movement of its own sublation, or to recognize in nature what makes the movement of spirit possible. To pursue this line of thought, I would first like to start with some consideration on the concept of the Anthropocene, which I believe can introduce some of the issues I intend to discuss. I will then try to highlight how the concept of the Anthropocene can be interpreted as a process of denaturalization of nature. Finally, drawing mainly on Hegel, I will try to show in what sense nature and spirit are not immediate concepts that claim to correspond to separate ontological domains, but rather how they highlight a processuality that is capable of emancipating them from their merely oppositional relationship. I go to the Anthropocene. The concept of the Anthropocene is certainly a problematic one, and not only or even primarily because the proposal to designate the age we are living in as the Anthropocene, meaning a new geological era in which humans are the decisive factor in determining biological, geological, and atmospheric processes on Earth, was rejected in March 2024 by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. Despite its rejection, in fact, it continues to be used, especially in the humanities and social sciences, because regardless of whether or not it meets the requirements for making a true geological era, it continues to be particularly effective in highlighting the fundamental characteristic of an epoch so decisively and dramatically marked by climate change, environmental devastation, and an unprecedented rate of extinction, and therefore by the radical consequences that these processes imply for different forms of life. It is no coincidence that the article in Science announcing the rejection of the term as a geological age was entitled "Anthropocene is Dead, Long Live the Anthropocene," thereby emphasizing that beyond the rejection by a specific scientific community of the term as capable of indicating a geological era, in the strict sense, the concept is here to stay. The problematic nature of the concept of the Anthropocene is closely linked to the concept of anthropos that it invokes, and therefore to the way in which the relationship between the natural and cultural or spiritual dimensions is conceived within it. According to Jason Moore, as is well known, the term Anthropocene is an ideological term. That is, a term that tends to neutralize the specific political, economic, and social implications of the phenomenon it is intended to denote. In fact, when we speak of the Anthropocene as the era in which humans have become the decisive factor in the transformation of planet Earth, we assume an abstract, dehistoricized, and delocalized anthropos as responsible for the ecological crisis. Rather than Anthropocene, we should therefore more properly speak of Capitalocene, historicizing and politicizing the term, meaning by it not a generic humanity as the origin of the current ecological crisis, but a specific and political system, economic and political system that certainly developed with the Industrial Revolution, but has its roots in the 16th century and is structurally based on the exploitation of human and non-human resources. Extractivism, the extraction of unpaid labor from nature and from humanity reduced in turn to nature, and on accumulation. In short, the problem is not anthropos, says Moore. The problem is the way capitalism organizes nature, including human nature. In this sense, according to Moore, the concept of capitalocene allows us to highlight how specific power relations and specific production relations have effectively shaped the environmental history of the planet, and how, therefore, so-called environmental policies only make sense if and only if they move towards a radical transformation of the economic and political system that has originated the disaster in which we are currently living, through a deconstruction of the structures that support it. From a perspective that differs from Moore's Marxist view, although not necessarily alternative to it, the concept of the Anthropocene is clearly problematic in that it appears to be the explicit expression of a model that is once again anthropocentric, or in any case centered on human subjectivity, which is considered on the one hand to be the cause of radical transformation of the Earth's biosphere, and on the other to be the only actor capable of re-establishing some kind of equilibrium. As Donna Haraway writes, the story told by the term Anthropocene is a little too simple. It is also a story that tends to attribute too much power to anthropos, once again considered a being endowed with exceptional characteristics compared to all other beings that make up the world. In short, the concept of Anthropocene implies a humanist preconception that must be deconstructed. The concept of the Anthropocene would thus be based once again on a metaphysical assumption that the concept does not question, namely that anthropos is the only true agent in the world, thereby reducing all other entities inhabiting the world to entities destined to suffer the action of the only true agent, namely the human being. In this sense, the concept of Anthropocene would be a concept that we could define as an hyper-modern concept, in that it continues to think of the world and its evolution as something that is in the hands and therefore under the domination of human subjectivity. The concept of the Anthropocene would therefore conceal an unconscious form of anthropocentrism, through which the world is thought of as the product of human action on nature, considered in purely objective terms, that is, as something passive and therefore inert and defenseless, on which such action would be exercised. Associated with the idea that anthropos is the sole responsible for the environmental crisis, or that anthropos is the only one with the power to determine the environmental history of the planet, there is in fact the Promethean idea of humans as the only ones who can save it, who can restore it to a state of equilibrium, or as the entity that must manage it to make it habitable again. It is a bit like anthropos being the CEO of a company, nature, who as CEO can lead it to ruin and failure, or save it and make it prosper. Whether we are talking about Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Gaia, the cosmological figure that, according to Latour, embodies a way of thinking about the world that lies beyond, or perhaps before modernity, or even the Cthulhucene, to use the term coined by Donna Haraway, which is made, I quote, which is made up of ongoing multi-species stories and practices of becoming with in times that remain at stake, in precarious times in which the world is not finished and the sky has not fallen yet. What is clearly being questioned within this type of discourse and categorization is the dualistic view that understands the world as the composition of nature and culture as separate, opposing domains. In a way, we could say that the Anthropocene, I use here the term as a generic marker that also includes the Capitalocene and the Cthulhucene and so on, forces us to think of a spiritualized nature and a naturalized spirit. Or rather, it makes necessary what we might call a process of denaturalization of nature, which is necessarily associated with a certain particular process of naturalization of culture. I believe Dipesh Chakrabarty's position is emblematic in this regard. According to Chakrabarty, the Anthropocene has clearly highlighted the collapse of the canonical and traditional distinction between human history and natural history. This collapse, or rather the impossibility of thinking about human history and natural history separately, constitutes, as Chakrabarty writes in The Climate of History, I quote, the most profound philosophical consequence of the current climate change crisis, end of quotation. In that, it radically questions what he calls, Chakrabarty, the humanistic project of modernity. In particular, when Chakrabarty states that, I quote, we need to think beyond the traditional humanist histories and engage with species history, even if we do not know how to write such a history, end of quotation, it is clear that he believes that the Anthropocene forces us to go beyond the rigid distinction between nature and culture, or to think of a dimension in which the denaturalization of nature corresponds to a certain naturalization of culture. But what does it mean to denaturalize nature and naturalize culture? Does it mean that it no longer makes sense to talk about nature and culture? Does it mean that the Anthropocene requires us to abandon this distinction? Rather than abandoning it, I believe it is necessary to dialecticize this. That is, to think of nature and culture as identical and different at the same time, in the sense that one always inhabits the other and is therefore inseparable from it, yet at the same time one is always different from the other, and in this difference performs a critical function with respect to the other, preventing each of these two concepts from becoming totally autonomous from the other. In a certain sense, it is a matter of trying to activate the movement indicated by Adorno, and perhaps not fully developed by Adorno himself, in his 1932 lecture entitled The Idea of Natural History. The aim of the path traced by Adorno in that text, so deeply marked by the confrontation with Heideggerian phenomenology and ontology, is explicitly to supersede the usual antithesis between nature and history. The verb used by Adorno is aufheben, as if to say that the removing of the antithesis to which that path tends does not mean the annulment of concepts, but rather their resemantization in terms that are no longer merely oppositional, that is, in terms that go beyond the very possibility of naturalistic and spiritualistic unilateralism. I quote, every exclusion of natural stasis from the historical dynamic, writes Adorno, leads to false absolutes. Every isolation of the historical dynamic from the unsurpassably natural elements in it leads to false spiritualism. End of quotation. To supersede these antitheses, Adorno says, it is necessary, I quote, to comprehend historical being in its most extreme historical determinacy, where it is most historical as natural being. Or, if it were possible, to comprehend nature as an historical being, where it seems to rest most deeply in itself as nature. What Adorno believes we should consider, therefore, is the naturalness of history and the historicity of nature. As I mentioned, it seems to me that Adorno project remains in many ways just a project, an intention, so to say. In my opinion, this is also due to the fact that Adorno attempts to carry out this operation without ever thematizing nature in the true sense of the word. And in order to consider the historicization of nature, he refers to a dimension, what he calls das Mythische, which is basically an already historical dimension, or if you like, something not too far from the idea of a second nature, which precisely because it is second, is already something that goes beyond the first nature, which is not really brought into play in Adorno discourse. What I would like to propose here, therefore, is to activate the Adornian movement by bringing into play the notion of nature and spirit, or, to repeat Adorno's formula, to dialectically overcome or to supersede or to sublate, aufzuheben, the usual antithesis of nature and spirit, showing in what sense nature is always also spirit, and in what sense spirit is always also nature. To lay the basis for such an operation, I would like to refer to classical German philosophy, and in particular to the post-Kantian debate, where I believe we can find a truly radical attempt to overcome the usual antithesis between nature and spirit. This overcoming has as its focal point the concept of life, understood on the one hand as a movement of transcendence of nature within nature itself, and on the other as that which reveals spirit of the overcoming of nature in an inalienable entanglement with nature itself. Life in this sense, namely as an objectivity that is at the same time also agency and subjectivity, is the concept that shatters the conception of a world divided into objects on the one hand and subjects on the other, into matter on the one hand and freedom on the other, into bodies and souls, and that forces one to think subjectivity in substance itself, freedom in matter itself, and soul in the body itself. It is from this background that we can grasp this double movement of naturalization and denaturalization, whereby nature takes on a critical function with respect to the spirit's position as radical autonomy with respect to the other. And spirit takes on a critical function with respect to nature, understood as a space of love devoid of history and any form of internal agency. The first step in this direction was taken by Kant in the Critique of Judgment. In the first paragraph of the Critique of Judgment, Kant makes a clear distinction between the concept of nature and freedom. The concepts of nature are such that their necessity does not depend on any will. The concepts of freedom, on the other hand, depend on a will, and the word they unveil is not the word as we perceive it through our senses. That is, it is a world in which things do not happen according to the same necessity that we can find within nature. At the same time, Kant attempts to escape this dualism precisely in the Critique of Judgment. In particular, in the Critique of the Teleological Judgment, Kant produces what can be described as the first movement of denaturalization of nature, focusing on what could be defined as a sort of subjectivity of nature, or what we might call a kind of natural agency. In autopoietic natural system, in fact, the organization of the parts with respect to the whole is intelligible, according to Kant, only insofar as one relates this organization to the purpose to which it appears to be appointed. In particular, as it is well known, according to Kant, the purposivness proper to natural systems is an internal purposivness, that is, not one relating to the usefulness of another, whereby the purpose is such only relative to something else, and therefore accidentally by the very thing to which it is ascribed. Internal purposiveness implies that the same thing is cause and effect of itself, that the purpose which the thing is to accomplish is such for the thing itself. Internal purposiveness is, in this sense, what might be called a sort of purposive agency. That is, an ability of these entities to act in the direction of their realization. In systems that are able to reproduce, self-maintain, and self-regulate, nature, who does, according to Kant, manifest an intrinsic agency of its own. The acceptance of natural purposiveness, however, is extremely problematic for Kant. Indeed, the fact that some entities of nature evidently appear to be purposively structured does not authorize the assumption that something like a final cause acts in nature. To attribute such a model of causality to nature would in fact mean, playfully for Kant, to presuppose an intelligence as the origin or justification of purposes. This does not exclude our having recourse to this kind of causality, only that at the very moment we do so, we must be aware that we are doing so, Kant says, only by analogy with the only causality, according to Kant, that it is possible to think of without contradiction, and that is that which presupposes an intelligence, an intention, a will as its justification. The judgment that identifies the organized entity of nature as characterized by intrinsic agency is thus for Kant a reflective judgment and not a determinative one. The attribution of agency has for Kant as a precondition the idea of an intentionality that originates it. In this would lie what Kant himself calls the contradiction of the concept of a natural purpose. For, on the one hand, in order to be natural, the purpose cannot refer back to any intention that supports it. On the other hand, the notion of a purpose is conceivable only with reference to an intention. In the annotation to the paragraph 204 of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, Hegel states that, I quote, with the concept of internal purposiveness, Kant has reawakened the idea in general and in particular the idea of life, end of quotation. And immediately afterwards, he observes the Aristotelian determination of life already contains internal purposiveness and therefore is infinitely more advanced than the concept of modern teleology, which took into account only the finite external purpose. What Hegel, in the wake of Aristotle, intends to point out is that the internal purposiveness, or if you want, internal agency, is a structure that characterizes Wirklichkeit as such, and that the Kantian idea that internal purposiveness cannot have a constitutive value with respect to nature would be nothing more than a reflection of a subjectivist view dominated by the separation of subjectivity and word. The point had already been raised by Schelling in the Ideen zu einer Philosophie der Natur, where he states that the structure of the natural organized entity implies a concept, which, however, Schelling writes, lives in itself, cannot be separated from it at all. The organism is for Schelling an objective structure that has a subjective dimension. And this subjective dimension, what we earlier called purposive agency, is not something that is imposed from outside on the object, because, Schelling writes, here at least the form is absolutely inseparable from the matter, the concept from the object. To think of this inseparability means for Schelling to think of the spirit in nature. To think of the spirit in nature, which does not mean thinking again of an external element that would go to vivify nature, but thinking that nature itself is a process that is not separate from the spiritual dimension. Schelling writes, a long quotation, "Thus, here again we encounter that absolute union of nature and freedom in one and the same being. The animate organization is to be the product of nature. But in this product of nature, there is to reign an ordering, synthesizing spirit. These two principles are not to be separated in it at all, but intimately united. In the contemplation, the two are not to be distinguishable at all. Between the two, there is to be no before and no after, but absolutely simultaneity and interaction." It is thus clear that thinking of internal purposiveness as something that is in nature and not derived from the imposition of external categorical requirements derived from subjectivity outside it requires a different ontology of nature than Kantian ontology. And it is in this direction that it is possible to read the Hegelian philosophy of nature. For Hegel, nature is the idea in the form of otherness, which does not mean that nature is simply the other from the idea, but rather, and this makes a great difference, that nature is the idea in the form of being other. The idea is the key term in what may be called Hegel's ontology. And it is therefore from the determination of the idea that the Hegelian ontology of nature can be understood. The idea is in Hegel a structure that implies the interpenetration of thinking and being, and therefore intends the overcoming of the separation between subjectivity and objectivity. The idea is neither only subjective nor only objective. That is, it is neither a substance in the classical sense of the term, nor a concept that belongs as such to a subjective thinking other than reality, nor a mere ontological determination, nor a mere epistemological determination. By saying that nature is the idea in the form of the externality, Äußerlichkeit, Hegel says that nature as externality is certainly a way of being in which objectivity is fractured with respect to its conceptual dimension. And yet, he also says that nature, however fractured in this form, is nevertheless a manifestation of the idea, an articulation of that dynamic unity, of that agency in which the subjective is constituted through the objective and the objective through the subjective. Nature is in this sense that process which, from a maximum of externality between objective and subjective dimension, tends in the direction of their interpenetration, which emerges within the final part of the philosophy of nature in organic physics, that is, in the treatment of the organism. And it is significantly here, that is, within a naturalistic context, that the concept of subjectivity finds its first real thematization in Hegelian systematic development. I quote, "The organism is in fact a negative, self-endowed, selbstische, and subjective unity. That is, it is a self-referential dynamic structure, an objectivity that tends in the direction of its own realization, in the direction of its own subjectivity. The organism, put differently, is the activity of an objectivity that has in itself, and not in other than itself, the focus of its own movement and thus of its own purpose. One could say that the dimension of natural subjectivity is a dimension of the crisis of a notion of nature understood as objectivity opposed to subjectivity. Natural subjectivity is indeed natural, completely natural. And at the same time, it tends toward a kind of exceeding of the natural understood as mere objectivity. By positing this overcoming of nature in nature itself, Hegel argues decisively beyond a consideration of nature as a purely objectual dimension in contrast with spirit as the realm of subjectivity. And this is because both nature and spirit are manifestations, admittedly different, of the dynamic subject-objective, processual and dialectical unity that is the idea. From a certain point of view, Hegel's position seems, on the one hand, to proceed in the direction of naturalization of subjectivity, showing how the mode of being that it is proper to the subject finds its first real articulation within nature. On the other hand, however, it also proceeds to a kind of process of redetermination of the concept of nature, which, if one thinks of the modern concept of nature as pure exteriority and passivity with respect to subjectivity, could also decline in the form of a denaturalization of nature. For if, on the one hand, placing the genesis of subjectivity within nature prevents one from thinking of subjectivity as the eruption of a supernaturalistic principle on a pre-existing natural substratum. On the other hand, thinking of nature as the place in which something like subjectivity takes shape prevents one from reducing nature to that mere exteriority devoid of agency that nevertheless constitutes the way through which it, at least prima facie, constitutes itself as nature. This movement of denaturalization of nature has its counterpart in Hegel in the movement of naturalization of the spirit. The externality that indelibly marks nature is an externality that involves, if anything, the spirit itself. And not only because the structure of subjectivity finds its first expression in Hegel precisely within natural externality, the treatment of animal organisms, but because the externality that so peculiarly determines the way of being of nature runs on closer inspection through the whole of reality, including reality of spirit. Reality, in fact, in order to exist for Hegel, is always externality. In order to exist, the real can only be external. It can only expose itself, manifest itself. In order to be real, it must mark a difference with respect to the purely logical noetic plane. And this difference is precisely externality. Of course, in spirit, externality is overcome through the self-reflective dimension of thinking, which by thinking the externality that constitutes it, supersedes it as a mere externality. But this does not mean that the spirit is located somewhere else with respect to externality. The spirit supersedes externality in externality. According to Hegel, unlike nature, spirit is concrete universality, so that in it, unlike in nature, the concept has a corresponding reality. In this, however, Hegel emphasizes that spirit develops and realizes a tendency of nature itself. The most concrete manifestation of nature is life, whose emergence is for Hegel the irruption of subjectivity into nature. Spirit is therefore, according to Hegel, life that knows itself, and in knowing itself supersedes the immediacy of natural life. Spirit, however, is not something different from nature and life. It is not a realm that is autonomous and separate from nature, which has finally and decisively removed the externality in which life as nature is necessarily immersed. The spirit as life that knows itself is certainly the process of superseding the externality between concept and existence, between the subjective element and the objective element that still affects natural externality. But in order to be this process, the process of superseding, spirit implies externality, that is, a never perfect adequacy between the conceptual dimension and the existential or real dimension. A constitutive element, so externality is a constitutive element of its own being, that is, as an element that characterizes it in all its realization, from the simplest to the highest and most complex. Of course, the spirit is the truth of nature. And in this truth, says Hegel, nature disappears. The spirit is the truth of nature because the idea that is only an internal element in nature is concretely realized in spirit. That is what Hegel means by his famous expression that spirit is zurückkommen aus der Natur. But precisely to the extent that spirit is a return to itself from nature, spirit is never a condition of simple adherence between concept and reality. But it is an activity, a movement, a path that unfolds with externality, in which nature is not simply a stage that has been left behind, but is a constitutive, a determining element of this activity. In this sense, spirit is never the autonomous simple unity of concept and objectivity, but rather the activity of becoming this unity, the process of its realization. The spirit is not the perfect adherence between reality and its own concept. If this were the case, there would not be development, no unfolding, no activity, and therefore no history. Thinking of spirit as the process of its own realization means thinking of spirit as that dimension that is never quiet and static, which is realized through its own continuous struggle against externality, which is therefore a constitutive element of its way of being. Going back to the issue that got us started, what the Anthropocene asks us to think about is the complex interweaving between denaturalized nature and naturalized spirit, or despiritualized spirit. And even thought it seems a bit contradictory to the big role it gives to the idea of anthropos. Anthropocene asks us a radical de-anthropologization of the idea of the word. De-anthropologizing the discourse on the word means trying to think the word, knowing, of course, that when one thinks it, one always thinks it from the point of view of the human, but at the same time, that the human is not something that is behind, below, or above the word, but belongs to it, is one of the threads whose interweaving with other threads constitutes the word. As Donna Haraway says, humans are not being in the word, as Heidegger says, but being of the word. It is not a matter of including in the human dimension what is other from it, or of humanizing nature, are in some forms of today's anthropology, but rather of thinking the human within the relations in which it is constituted, and thus, if one passes the expression, of naturalizing the human through a denaturalization of nature. In the naturalization of the human takes place, if the naturalization of the human takes place on the basis of a concept of nature typical of modernity, it can only take the form of a reduction of the human to a mere object, and thus, as happened with nature as well, to something that one can dispose of as any object. The naturalization of human makes sense only if it is intertwined with the form of denaturalization of nature, or rather, only if we can conceive of nature not as the opposite of spirit and spirit as the opposite of nature, but if we succeed, to borrow Adorno's formula, in overcoming the antithesis between nature and spirit. Denaturalizing nature means therefore liberating nature from a reductive and reductionist conception of its mode of being that rests entirely on the antithesis with the human and that matches, even when opposed to it, an always anthropocentric view of the world. To think together the naturalization of the human and the denaturalization of nature means in this sense not so much to reduce subjectivity to a nature that is set against it, but to think subjectivity in and of nature, that is, to think what is called agency as something that is constitutive of the word in its whole itself, that is, that characterizes also nature's very way of being. This process has, among other things, powerful implication on both the ethical and political levels. Indeed, it implies the need for rearticulation of fundamental notions such as that of law, society, and the commons. Likewise, the resemantization of nature in terms of agency moves against all those all those forms of naturalization that underline oppressive dynamics towards unrecognized subjectivities, insofar as precisely they are traced back to a nature devoid of agency. Within this logic, considering certain forms of life as simply natural is a way of not recognizing them. considering them precisely as dimensions devoid of authentic agency, and therefore as modes of being devoid of autonomy and that take on meaning only from the use made of them by the subjectivity that is instead considered agent in the full sense. Today's criticism of the distinction between nature and culture is often based on the oppressive outcomes that this dualistic conception would imply. As the Australian philosopher Val Plumwood has noted, however, while the critique of the concept of nature is mostly based on the fact that this concept has been used to universalize and justify by regarding them as natural, oppressive arrangements that are in fact contingent and historical, culturalist and constructivist approaches that oppose these forms of naturalization are no less problematic, in that they mostly tend, so Plumwood, simply to denounce this model while leaving intact the kind of conceptualization that supports it. According to Plumwood, a genuine recognition of the hidden or denied social and cultural elements must go hand in hand with the recognition of the hidden or denied elements of agency in the sphere of nature. This is the only way, according to Plumwood, this is the only way out of an exclusionary opposition between nature and culture, that is, out of the opposition between a naturalism that tends to reduce cultural, social, and historical elements to mere epiphenomena of natural laws that purport to be eternal and universal, and the culturalism that tends to deny the very idea of nature as something not instituted and not constructed by the human. The removal of nature that characterizes a substantial part of contemporary thinking related to the Anthropocene exposes, in this sense, to a risk that can have decisive effects. Getting rid of nature, in fact, risks being a way through which one tends to get out of the way with nature the element of resistance and friction that nature, even one's own nature, is for the subject. In this sense, the overcoming of the antithesis between nature and culture does not tend trivially to the reduction of spirit to nature or nature to spirit, but rather to a philosophical redefinition of this concept, moving from the need to think subjectivity, agency in and of nature. That is, to think agency as something that is constituted in nature itself and that characterizes the mode of being of a nature that is neither the other from subjectivity nor a projection of it. Thinking about natural agency, taking on in productive terms the oxymoronic character that its concept exhibits, means moving in the direction of a decolonization of nature and consequently of a fluidization of the relationship between nature and culture. What I intend to argue is that only in this way can we move away from a consideration of nature as a neutral background against which autonomous subjectivity acts. That is, by assuming nature as an element that co-determines the very structure of spirit and therefore interacts with its decision-making systems. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Luca. There's a lot of hands here. I'm going to make a ruling here as a lower order judge and say that since we started late, we also will take an extra 5 minutes for this. But now I'll turn it over to the Supreme Court here as to whether that's actually the right way to do it. Thomas.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I have one question about the connection between the Anthropocene and denaturalizing nature, naturalizing spirit. Yeah. So there's one way in which this kind of transitional zone is already created by life, as you showed with regard to Kant's third critique and with the way Hegel picks it up. And in this notion of life, we see a way in which nature and spirit are articulated such that we have this zone that allows for the emergence of spirit in nature and for spirit becoming nature again in a way that is, it seems, works well, forms a certain type of unity. And now I was struck by the way in which you said that this is the Anthropocene, these two processes. And I'm wondering whether we would need to say something more specific about the Anthropocene, because in the Anthropocene, it seems, on the one hand, we don't have this clearly in view, so we don't understand this. So that's part of it, maybe. But also certain objects are created that are, so there is a zone created where these two things don't link up. So nature is being denaturalized by way of creating all kinds of, so the kinds of materials that Latour is so interested in, asbestos, right? So natural substance is created. That's not quite spiritual, right? So it's not lending itself to our own cultural, so it's not a good basis for what we want to do in a certain sense. Mm-hmm. But something weird is produced that is a hybrid of nature and spirit, but that is at odds with both in a certain sense. So it kind of undermines natural cycles, it undermines spiritual cycles. So my proposal would be, isn't the Anthropocene a disturbance of these processes, a disturbance of these two processes, or them coming apart in a way that we did not foresee when we read the third critique or when we read Hegel's philosophy of nature?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I think you are right. I wanted not to, so to say what the Anthropocene is, but what the Anthropocene gives us to think, as what the Anthropocene forces us to think. And I think we can say there are two levels. There is a level that we can call a sort of descriptive level, where we have to say what the Anthropocene is, what the Anthropocene has produced. And in this direction, I think that your proposal is totally right. But what is interesting for me here is the Anthropocene the crisis of the notions we have used in order to comprehend the world? In what sense? What kind of resemantization asks the Anthropocene to us? And in this sense, I tried to show that the annulment of the traditionally categories are really problematic, and that we have a sort of philosophical task to redefine these categories in the age of the Anthropocene. In this sense was, but what you say about the object Anthropocene or hyper-object Anthropocene is totally right in your direction.
Adeline?
Thank you, Luca.
In Italian, Elena.
Okay, shall I? So what language? Thank you, Luca. This was great, and as you know, I'm very sympathetic with this approach. So I'm going to ask you a question I'm struggling with myself, so maybe you can help me. Sometimes I wonder whether Hegel or German idealism as a tradition is really the best tradition to retrieve, to rethink these culture, nature categories in a non-dualistic way or beyond modernity. And this is for two reasons. Like, one is that in this tradition we have a centrality of self-consciousness as the highest form of thinking, and also in a way the highest realization of, for instance, in Hegel, like the idea, or it's very hard to challenge this centrality. And this is a very human form of intelligence, like even in debates that try to find intelligence in animals and plants, the reflexivity of self-consciousness is really not there. So it's hard to then relate this tradition with this kind of attempts to have continuity between nature and culture in terms of intelligence. And then the other issue I see, or the thing I struggle with and came up in your talk, is the centrality of teleology, like the organism as the sort of paradigm of this interconnection or entanglement between subjectivity and objectivity. And there I have an issue with this teleological model, because I see it very heavily connected to this autonomy that we've been discussing from yesterday and today. Because for the organism, the subjectivity is all about like maintaining itself, digesting the other, self-preserving, and yeah, I do wonder if then, like, for the questions that the Anthropocene poses, that's the best model, and you know, the alternative would be Spinoza. So, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. My friend Gunnar Hendricks told me that I am a Spinozist Hegelian, and so for the first point, so to simplify, a humanist conception of thinking, or as the idea as the manifestation of this kind of thinking, who were the pivotal notion of German idealism, is a very complicated matter. I try to understand thinking about which Hegel says as a non-humanist thinking in this sense, as, so to say, the possibility of human thinking to supersede itself, to go against himself or a higher self. And it is interesting for me because spirit and nature in Hegel are the results of these wonderful and problematic movement of the freien Klassen, and I don't know in English how it is, free release of the idea into reality. And I think that in this notion there is something interesting for us, in the sense that the idea is not, I think, a sort of thinking independent from reality, but it is the inner structure of reality that can manifest itself into the externality of reality. So it's not a sort of thinking separated from reality, but it is the structure who manifests itself in reality. I don't think I given an answer to your question, but for me this is the problematic point, and sort of bracket. You know, I don't love to speak about German idealism because I don't think that Hegel is an idealist in the strict sense of the term, and that Hegel is a realist idealist, so to say, or an anti-idealist idealist. Yeah, well, life as, so to say, self-preserving or organism as a teleology moving into this direction of self-preserving, of autonomy, and so on. Yeah, it is right what he says, but I think that this movement, we have to understand what we mean when we say teleology, because teleology is really in Hegel this sort of agency that is in the thing in itself. It is not a sort of movement who direct things, who goes to substances a peculiar direction, but it is the direction, the movement itself, the agency of the things, and not something that is imposed, so to say, to the things. And yeah, there is this a dynamic of self-preserving, of auto-organization, and so of autonomy. But it is always a dynamic that is entangled with something that is not that organism. The organism is never independent from the constraints in which he lives. So there is an Heideggerian notion in the course Heidegger told in 1930, perhaps, Grundbegriffe der Metaphysik, where Heidegger discusses the notion of organism in relation to von Uexküll and his direction. And he says that what we call, how is ambient, the ambiente? Yeah, I wanted an English word. Environment, yeah. That environment is not something where the organism lives, but is part, so to say, of the organism. The environment is constitutive of the organism itself. And so this movement of self-preserving, of autonomy, if you want, of the organism, is never a movement, so to say, isolated, an abstract movement of this abstract organism who moves itself into the world. But it is a movement that is always entangled with the world, that is always produced by what it produces, in a certain sense. Okay, thank you.
We're officially out of time, but as a lower court judge, I'm going to rule we get another 2 minutes extension. This may be overruled by the Supreme Court, but Isabel. Andy?
I spoke too much. Sorry.
Sorry. We'll try for the rest of you here. I was just trying to take things into order that they appear here.
Thank you, Luca. That was really great. I have a question on your account of Hegel's philosophy of nature and the way. Well, I really liked how you described the idea in its otherness and how subjectivity becomes objective in the organism. And then you said, like, there is a way to describe that the overcoming of nature is posed in nature. And then I thought there are like two options, because the one is to say the overcoming of nature within nature is namely to see how subjectivity becomes objective in the organism. But on the other hand, then there seems to be no way to describe it as a continuity between nature and spirit somehow, because then the sublation or transition from nature into spirit is somehow, there's a, I don't know, somehow a lücke. Or the other way around were to say, like, no, the overcoming of nature within nature means to get the step, the transition from nature to spirit. But at the same time, I'm always struggled, and so I was wondering what you make about that, because it's somehow difficult, because nature is not, so the end of nature is not the Geschlechtsverhältnis, but it's death. And then it seems nothing follows out of the movement within nature. It's just nothing, and it follows nothing for nature and nothing for spirit. So, yeah, I would be curious what you make out of that.
Andy?
So.
Yeah, super quick. So this is, I think, a follow-up on Elena's second question about the focus on life. You said, I think I like the idea that you don't want to make spirit into something supernatural that just kind of intervenes. But I worry with a focus so much on life that you make life into something effectively supernatural that just intervenes in the rest of nature. And so you don't have to, I think, with Hegel, right? Because Hegel gives us earlier stages that are non-mechanical, like interaction, for instance, Wechselwirkung. Just take one instance in which you could see in mass in the philosophy of nature, and then also in the philosophy of spirit, you have mechanism, not just the animal coming out, but mechanism coming out in things like habit and representation and psychology. And so I was wondering if you would be open to extending the project past life in that way.
And now, Francesca, the pressure is on for you to really...
Be very short. Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic with wanting to overcome the dualism, but not overcoming the difference of nature and spirit. And so you try to do that by dialectics and by saying, okay, we have to denaturalize nature and naturalize spirit. And in order for it to function, these two movements have to be different. Otherwise, we would be back in, just imposing. But then you used like the concept of agency within both. So this concept must then mean something different. So there must be a difference in them. And I wonder how this works, so how to understand this difference. Yeah, that's the short version.
Okay. Now you can just give 3 yes or no answers.
I can't answer. I wanted only to say to Francesca that this is the topic of my project now. I have a project that is agency between nature and spirit, in order to understand the difference of agency, but on the basis of the acknowledgement of agency as something constitutive of nature too, so to say. So I don't have an answer, but life as something supernatural. I think that the notion of supernaturalism, it depends from a strict naturalism. It is only, so to say, an extension of the notion of naturalism. And so we have to work on these notion and perhaps to a new form of naturalism. Okay. Death, I think, is the central point for the experience of spirit. There is no spirit without death. And so if nature ended with death, death is the birth of spirit, so to say. This is problematic, I know, but okay. Sorry.
Very well. Luca, thank you very much. Okay.